Maybe my panelists can join me up here, and we'll get going with our panel. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Come on, let's go. Yeah, I know you're all digesting, and according to the well presenter this morning, we're all going to go into a 2-hour lag for a little while. Let's try to counteract that 2-hour lag. Look, it's my pleasure to be here with you today with my esteemed panelists. So we have got with us Ross McWhinney, Policy Advisor, New York Mayor's Office of Sustainability. On my far left, in the middle, Dave Ramslie, the Principal of Integral Group, and nearest to me, Nat Gosman, Director of Energy Efficiency Policy for the BC Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources. Starting with Ross. Ross is, I've actually been on a panel with Ross, and one of the few people in North America with deep experience in this space. He's the Policy Advisor for New York City's Greener, Greater Buildings Plan, working full-time in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability through the Institute of Market Transformation. He assists the office in the implementation and improvement of the city's energy and water benchmarking law, which is Local Law 87. And he develops legislative modifications and expansions of existing policies to increase the scope and effectiveness of the GGPP, as it's called. Dave Ramslie, who I've had the pleasure with working with on the Toronto initiative, is the Head of Planning and Research for Canada for Integral Group. He's a planner by training and a thought leader on urban sustainable development and energy policy, and his work has been recognized by the Canadian Institute of Planners, the Cascadia Regional Green Building Council, and the World Green Building Council. The rest of his bio goes on for a page and a half, but that's probably good enough, right, Dave? And then finally, Nat, who I've had the pleasure of just meeting. He's responsible for leading and overseeing energy efficiency initiatives in the policy, regulatory, and program domains, including oversight of utility demand-side management, planning, codes and standards development, and provincial program development. And most interestingly, Nat is currently working with his team on looking at, obviously, something to do with BC. That's why he's up on this panel. I've spent some time working with Ontario Hydro on the background to this. The numbers are this. Energy base load is around 15 cents a kilowatt hour in Ontario. It's nuclear. Conservation is 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour, all programs and incentives included. It was interesting to see Ed Masria last night talk about one line on his graph. No new generation is needed if we're more efficient going forward. I can tell you that from a political point of view, and maybe Ross will comment on this, society can't afford to build new hydroelectric dams or nuclear plants because you want to keep the lights on all night. We're past that stage. We also have the carbon issue to manage as well. Buildings are 30% of energy consumption and 50% direct and indirect of greenhouse gases emissions. We're not the first to be looking at mandatory energy disclosure as a tool to reduce the consumption piece. They've had it in the UK and the EU since 2009 for public buildings and more recently for private buildings. They've had it in the US. Well, Ross will tell us how long they've had it in the US for, but they have deep experience. That's why Ross is up here in the front of the room. We're looking at it for Canada. We're looking at it for Ontario and Toronto specifically. I know we're also looking at it for BC. That's why Dave is in the front of this room. And finally, because we're in BC, we need to know what's BC doing in this space. That's why Nat is in the room. So outside of the European area, we've got the best panelists we can get to talk about this issue going forward. Okay, so as a moderator, I get to ask a few questions while you're all thinking about your questions, and maybe I'll ask the questions that you were thinking of asking so you won't have to ask your questions. So let's start with some questions. So, Ross, let's start with you. Advice for, I mean, New York is really the poster child, I think, in North America for this approach. You've been at it for a long time, you're deep into it, you're refining it, it's a big city. What kind of advice would you have for Canadians to ensure market acceptance and avoid maybe some of the pushback you might have seen in early years or even currently?
Right, so, I think something that I didn't really cover in the presentation is that there was a pretty strong help desk outreach effort that was involved in Local 84's rollout. So, even to this day, we have a couple times a year meetings with the top consultants that provide service, benchmarking services, but earlier in the program, it was just a lot broader. It involved a help desk, a call-in desk, along with an email address, newsletters, some training sessions. In New York, about I think at this point, the top 40 consultants handle 55% or maybe 50% of the benchmark properties, but that was larger in past years. So reaching people or reaching out to them was very effective. But yeah, definitely at the beginning, outreach and help center type work is really important.
How did you fund that? I mean, who's paying for these people?
So that was a bit before my time. I think it was a mix of probably some nonprofit money. I know that the role of our benchmarking manager has come through that avenue and some grants. But yeah, I think it was a mix. And even to this day, we're looking to restart the help desk because there are plans to expand the threshold to 25,000 square feet in New York. And that's a group with lower resources, less experience, right. And it's going to be really important.
How about utility cooperation? In Ontario, we have a pretty fragmented local distribution system. How did it work in New York City? The utilities disclosing data? If the landlord doesn't have whole building data, how's that relationship been?
I'd say it's a work in progress. So we can get whole building data from our electric and gas utilities, and actually the water utility, which is public utility, has automatic disclosure in some buildings where there are the right type of meters, and that data will go straight through to portfolio manager. But in the case of Con Edison, which is the largest, it's the electricity utility, you're paying $102.50 for whole building data, and I think that's the only instance in the country really where building owners have to pay for that information. And then what you get back is a spreadsheet, which you then need to transcribe. Really provides the opportunity for a lot of human error to be introduced. From National Grid, it's a similar situation without a fee. And so I'd say this is where New York really could improve. Cities like Seattle, Chicago, Philadelphia, and several others have direct upload to Portfolio Manager. And if you're trying to make the program easier, the data quality more reliable, that's going to help in both of those areas to a very large degree.
Yeah, it's great. Dave, question for you. It's actually really good that Integral Group's doing the BC and the Ontario work at the same time, because you're getting to see from the implementation side maybe subtle differences in the structure of the utilities in the provinces and their current policies, and perhaps even some subtle differences in their goals. Do you see us being able to have a consistent national approach in Canada, based on your observations so far? Can we do this the same way in every province and every city?
Yeah, so actually, well, we worked for the City of Victoria on a building energy benchmarking proposal. We didn't actually work with the province yet, but, there's lots of hours left in today.
And your phone number is?
That's right, very accessible by email, on Twitter as well. So I think it is very possible. In fact, actually, it's been in a sense demanded by a lot of our property owners across Canada. So about 90% of our Class A office space, many of your members, as Michael, are pension-funded investor owners of real estate, and they've told us that, if you're going to do this for Ontario and Toronto specifically, that's a huge portion of their portfolios, and the last thing that they want is actually different standards in different provinces that their sustainability managers or their energy managers or, their boots on the ground have to meet different requirements, right? And I think that we heard from Nat too that that the province's interest in this is not only for climate reasons and energy efficiency reasons, but also for reasons of consistency to add some predictability to the market across sectors. So I think that there aren't really any. I don't think prohibitions. I don't think that we are the market is so diverse across Canada that there would be anything that would stop us from having a national standard or a national framework.
It reminds me of something that Ross, you said about New York dealing with the poor performers, and maybe there's greater gains with the poor performers, and you mentioned that you're dropping the threshold or planning on dropping the threshold of 25,000 square feet. So Nat, this must be something that you're thinking about, and probably they're thinking about in Ontario. If you're going to do a province-wide plan, but using the Ontario example, yeah, you've got REALpac members in downtown Toronto, fine, they're probably ready. But if you've got a 70,000 square foot owner in Sarnia, Ontario, who doesn't have the engineering firm access and the resources, how do you make this applicable to a province where you've got a variety of types of landlords and resources available to them locally?
Well, I think first of all, we would consider taking a staged approach as well. So there would be a market movement over time, building expectation and acceptance. And I think it's key that those supportive policies are in place before the requirement is in place. So, for, let's say, the smaller buildings, the lower performer, less sophisticated building owners and managers, ensuring that there are government and utility incentives in the market to bring them up to performance. Because obviously, when you introduce a requirement like this, you immediately have winners and losers. So it's key to anticipate the losers beforehand and take mitigating measures to make sure that everyone essentially is kind of on par to the extent possible once the requirements hit.
Yeah. We're about 10 after. I want to leave a bit of time because I'll get the high sign probably in 5 to 7 minutes for some questions from the audience. If there are any questions in the audience now is your opportunity. There's a microphone on both sides of the room. And I'll give people 30 seconds to think about whether they have the guts to get up and ask the tough question or not. Or whether, like the singing group that went up on the stage last night, you thought, I better not go up there and sing. I really don't know the words to that song. I really can't sing very well. It looks like none of you are singers, so I'm going to go on to my next question then. Hey, there's some singers back. Oh, there we go. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for a riveting conversation and discussion. I work for the city of Calgary, and as a municipality in a deregulated marketplace for electricity, I actually somewhat disagree with your comment about a standardized approach across the country. I think Alberta is a wee bit of an island when it comes down to the rest of the country. That being said, my concern is that we have a piece of regulation in our province that states that a government cannot introduce any sort of regulation that would otherwise create an imbalance or a competitive advantage or disadvantage for any market participant, particularly when it comes down to energy. So have you faced this particular regulatory challenge that potentially, given the litigious nature of some market participants in this country, that you might be creating an unfair playground for folks through regulation, and that essentially you're putting some in the bad sandbox and allowing others into the good kid sandbox? If you could discuss that a little bit, that would be very interesting.
Ross, do you want to take a shot at that? Is that?
Well, I can see how some, buildings that are not, don't have high energy efficiency would be concerned with having that information available. But I've definitely not heard that as a reason not to go forward. In New York City, we have restaurant grades on the front door when you walk in, an A, B, C, and my friends say if it's a C, that means, it's authentic. But no, it's actually, But, that's, I think, an example where, some people maybe were put at a disadvantage, but it's important information for the public.
Well, in that case, you're protecting the public good. So that's one clause that I have to work with, is if I'm trying to uphold the public good. Any other?
Yeah, I think this, what I would say, there's a lot of subjectivity in these rules, and that's just one of them, the trade-off between the right to privacy, but society's desire to reduce the consumption of energy. And we've had these discussions in Ontario about these various trade-offs, and depending on what group you'll have different points of view on that as well. So I'm going to go to this side and then back to you. So yes, someone we know.
Some know. Yeah. My question is for Ross, but actually for the entire panel, and for that matter, the moderator as well. The discussions about benchmarking regulations have often revolved around the difference between reporting and public disclosure or transparency. And so it seems that there's a fair bit of comfort in the industry with actually reporting, but there's a fair bit of discomfort about public transparency and the naming and shaming of some of the bad performers. I'd like to hear, Ross in particular, your thoughts on what happened in New York City with that dichotomy, and I'd like to hear from others as well as to what the thoughts are in Canada, because we tend not to try to offend people.
Okay, Ross.
Yeah, so, I'd say in New York, we're still dealing, I showed you the Philadelphia website, which was, I think, the first, such a clear communication of that information. In New York, it's still the spreadsheet approach, and so it's not really out there for people to absorb and digest. And so I'd say that maybe that conversation hasn't been totally played out yet. I think that, like I said, the Urban Green Council is releasing a website, I think, in the next couple weeks, which will post that public disclosure data with energy use intensity and Energy Star scores. But that data is public, and that's a NGO that's working with it as anyone else could. So yeah, I guess maybe the story is still being written to an extent.
Dave and Nat, you have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a range of disclosure. So, on the one hand, you have aggregated data that's released by building segment, where you're not necessarily pointing a finger at a specific property, but yet you're giving the public a sense of the actual overall energy performance of the city. So, I think you can kind of take more conservative approaches to disclosure, and perhaps, again, there's a staged approach as well, which moves, perhaps towards the other side, depending on the political acceptance and of that particular jurisdiction.
Yeah, there was, we had at the same panel that Michael and Ross were on when we did this in Toronto, there was a guy named Ben Meyer who was the property manager for Boston Properties. Boston Properties has real estate in both Boston, New York, I believe, and in San Francisco, all of which have building energy benchmarking and disclosure requirements. And his great tagline was, you play a different game when someone's keeping score, right? And so this idea that people were keeping score, so they had to train up, get healthy and get their buildings in order. What I would say on disclosure is that there's mitigating policy mechanisms that can be used, right? If you want to start reporting right away, but we can say that we're not going to actually disclose that information for, say, 3 years, for example, right? That would should allow somebody long enough to get their house in order to if they're embarrassed about their energy score in some way to move that along, right? And as far as equity and competitive advantage, I think if a standard is being applied to an entire marketplace, there is an equity there, right? And I think if everyone's using the same tool, there's some equity there, for better or for worse. And we kind of went around and around to we're trying to find what is that competitive advantage that people are gaining by knowing how much energy you're consuming in your restaurant. So I think a lot of people make, this is going to affect our business in some way, but business, what do they spend? About $1 a square foot on energy use or something like that. So it's, we're not talking about big strategic, corporate secrets here when we're talking about how much you're spending on a gigajoule or how many gigajoules you're using.
So I'd say, I can see some people's discomfort, but in New York, there are also energy audit requirements for that same set of buildings. And then we also are, working on we're calling an energy retrofit accelerator, which is intended to identify buildings that have room for improvement, and basically bring them to incentives, help them understand how they can finance the outcome of their energy audits and retro-commissioning report. And so, there is some kind of pressure, definitely, but there's also some help coming from the city in that regard to help them improve their performance.
Thanks. We've got a question over here next.
Thank you. Our job as green building advocates would be made a lot easier in Canada if we actually had provincial building codes that use the performance levels suggested in the model National Building Code. I'm curious for my Canadian counterparts, in some ways what you're suggesting comes in the back door to compensate for what we don't have in place as provincial building codes. Can you talk a bit about the tension between what you're trying to do and the legislative environment in which you have to work?
Dave, do you want that one, or?
Yeah, we do a lot of code work, and I'd say that the real advantage of building energy benchmarking and disclosure is that it's a tool that really supports the existing building market, right? And if we're actually gonna tackle climate change in a meaningful way, new buildings are obviously hugely important, but in every climate plan that I've ever seen at a city level, retrofits are always the biggest part of that package, right? And so, and I would also posit too that no industry knows less about its products than the building industry, right, and how they're performing. So I think this benchmarking as its value is, I think, allows us to understand the existing building market better. And it does allow us to make better codes down the road. I think that when we in 2008 wrote the Green Homes program for the city of Vancouver, it was the first code to actually require third-party energy assessment and scores for each house that was built. And then 3 years later, when we were designing a new code, we had all this attribute data on every home that had ever been built in the city of Vancouver since the last code. And whereas we were spending $100,000 in a study to design our new Vancouver building bylaw, we were able to do it for about $20,000 and we actually were able to go to council with real data, which I think is, we're about to have a policy and building code revolution. I know it sounds really exciting, right? A building code revolution. Yeah, I'm excited. Because we're gonna really understand our market for the first time, right? And I think that's gonna, we're seeing in like the New York policies that multi-unit residential buildings of newer vintages are using more energy than the older ones, and yet codes are supposed to be getting more tighter, and that's a big deal, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the attention to the codes maybe came a bit after that increase, because it was happening over a couple of decades, where the newer buildings were, are bigger consumers. I think largely because of so many windows in the buildings, really. But no,
we don't do that in Vancouver at all.
No, right? Yeah.
I wonder if we should wrap up now. We're 5 minutes over our intended completion time. Look, this was a really interesting discussion. I'm sure this will be a discussion probably the next 3 or 4 years going forward at this event, because we'll have more experience in Ontario and Toronto and BC and perhaps other cities by then. So it's going to be fascinating to learn and to watch that. But the top line here is that disclosure does save energy. That data is in from the US, and when you keep score, people play the game differently. Particularly in the coal-fired provinces, we don't want unlimited supply so you can keep the lights on all night. So this is almost more important there than perhaps elsewhere. And these gentlemen here are leaders in the space. So please join me in thanking them for coming and speaking today.